Shalom. I want to start off by giving all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashum, Yahweh Bahashum, Rachak Kodash. I want to give double honors to our apostles and elders of Great Millstone who rule well in grace and peace, to you elect around the four winds, believing and pushing this truth in all sincerity. May the blessing of election be upon your houses. This is your fellow servant, Rakar from the GMS Orlando camp, coming at you with another impromptu lesson. And tonight, I want to get into a little bit of a land back on this lesson that was done by the priest Hashakwala from the GMS Atlanta camp. And his lesson is entitled, Look at Your Brother's Countenance, and You Will Know What to Pray For. And this lesson touched my spirit, because I've been in that same spirit of observation these past few weeks, just taking things in through the spirit, observing different brothers' countenances, mindsets, talking points, examining myself to see where I could step up amongst the brotherhood as well. And as I've been observing, I've seen a lot of what the priest is speaking about when it comes to a brother's countenance really speaking for itself. Because a lot of times a brother's countenance really can say all that needs to be said without him even having to open his mouth. And it just had me meditating on the importance of us being our brother's keepers. And being our brother's keeper, we have to pay attention to these little details, such as a brother's countenance or his mindset or certain speaking points that he's making. Because in those details are signs of what a brother may need prayer for. And prayer is one of our mightiest weapons, one of our mightiest tools, that we've been given through the spirit and power of Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushai. Not only as a tool to utilize for ourselves, but as a tool to utilize for the brethren around us. All right, to sharpen each other, to strengthen each other, to fortify each other. All right, to bring each other into the unity of the faith. Prayer is one of our mightiest tools. It's our medicine, like the elder apostle Rakar likes to refer to quite frequently. And a lot of signs that brothers show through their countenance or through their mindset or, just a lot of times just through their countenance really are a sign of what they need prayer for. The medicine that you can pray for them through the spirit. But I want to get into, this is a brief lesson, man. Just had a few precepts that came to mind. But as a matter of fact, I actually want to play a few minutes of the priest video. All right, Lord, when this is edifying unto you elect, you should really watch this whole video and listen to this whole video.
Actually seeing or looking at brothers, faces, you know what I'm saying? And that can, a brother's countenance tells you a lot.
Salaki, and one point that I've made to brothers, a while back is the importance and the gravity behind the salute, that we do every time we meet. It's not just something that we rehearse just to rehearse, or it's not just words that we say just to say. When we greet each other, with Yahweh Bahashum Yahushai Barakatah, or Yahweh Bahashum Yahushai Bahashum Rachak Kodash Barakatah, that is a blessing, that we're placing amongst each other, while we're meeting, and it's something that holds a lot of weight, because as brothers go through their week, a lot of times brothers are in need of that blessing. Or if you may meet up with a brother in the middle of the week or throughout the week, a lot of times brothers need that blessing, to continue. So it's not something that should be said frivolously, or done frivolously. It's something that holds a lot of weight, and you can tell a lot, from that greeting, how strong it is. Some brothers come in with that weak sauce, man, and you already know that brother going through it. You know, a brother, you know that brother, something going on, you know. But the greeting in itself is something that holds a lot of weight, and that shouldn't be taken frivolously.
And that's pretty much what this is going to be about. And I'm going to, I guess, align it with just one specific thing, because bros, we all go, all of us, we go through something. Our hell is not unique. You know, our hell is not unique. Or whatever you go through, whatever that brother goes through, whatever, it's not unique. It's what's common to the normal individual. It's just the only thing that is different is we're not going through it in vain, like the millions upon millions are going through their hells in, you know, unfortunate circumstances in vain. You know, we're not going through it in vain because we have the Lord, and we're going through it for a purpose. We're actually being molded and created into something that's going to be beautiful. Our spirits are being, you know, shaped into something that's going to be extraordinary when it's all said and done. But again, I want to stay on topic, is actually looking at bros' faces. Again, I know we kind of sometimes hide what we're going through pretty well, but sometimes you just gotta like pay attention a little bit more. You know, maybe when you salute a brother.
Right, and that's a beautiful point, you know, because sometimes we have to pay attention a little bit more, you know, to the details and to the signs that, you know, brothers are giving off sometimes, because it's a part of knowing the state of the Lord's flock. It says Proverbs 27 and verse 23. It says, "Be thou diligent to know the state of thy flocks, and look well to thy herds." You know, and the flock isn't just the innumerable multitude of believers, you know, sitting, you know, watching videos and listening behind the scenes. You know, a huge part of that flock is us through the Spirit. You know, the prophets, you know, the men on the highways and byways, the men standing stiffly for the name of Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. You know, we are a part of the Lord's flock as well. And we also have to be diligent to know the state of the flock around us, you know, the brethren around us, because we are the Lord's sheep. You know, although we, through the Spirit, have been set up as he goats, you know, we are the Lord's sheep. So we have to be diligent to know the state of the Lord's flock, because the Lord takes special care for each and every brother that's around us. You know, every brother carries a piece of Yahushua within his spirit, you know, and the Lord cares very deeply for brothers, you know. So, and us knowing how deeply the Lord cares for his flock and for brothers, we have to be diligent, you know, to know the state of the Lord's flock. We have to pay attention to those little signs, you know, those little details, you know, so that we can, you know, possibly step in and be our brother's keeper through prayer. You know, a lot of times it's going to manifest through prayer. Sometimes it's going to manifest through a counsel, or, you know, through a one-on-one with a brother, or through a conversation, you know. But like the priest mentioned, man, you know, a lot of times brothers like to hide what they're going through. You know, brothers don't really like to express what they're going through, you know, because they become accustomed, you know, through the Spirit, we become accustomed to the trials. You know, we've learned to be at peace with the obstacles that are thrown our way through the Spirit, and to rely on the Lord for that standard to be uplifted. So a lot of times brothers can hide, or, you know, don't like to express what they're going through. But sometimes, you know, brothers can hide it to a point where it becomes unfruitful, you know, for the men around him. You know, the brother might not even know it. You know, brother just going through his hell. He just going through what the Lord is taking him through. He's being hardened. You know, we might not realize that, you know, his spirit is affecting the men around him. You know, he might be in a woe is me spirit, or he might develop a over a spirit, you might over a hardened spirit to compensate for what he's going through. You might not notice that he's affecting the brethren around him, or he's not yielding, what he can through the spirit for the brotherhood. Sometimes you don't notice. Brothers be in that tunnel vision sometimes. And, it can start to affect things around them, in their countenance and certain speaking points that they may have, certain mindset that, you might notice a brother starting to shift into. And that's where, a conversation or, if the conversation, the word prayer can step in and intervene, through the spirit and power of Yahweh Shai, because if it's anything or anybody that can reach brothers deeply, where they need to be reached, it's the Lord. It's the Lord. Excuse me. So again, it says, "Be thou diligent to know the state of thy flocks, and look well to thy herds." And as we look well to the herd of the Lord, as we, teach through the Spirit, we also are looking well to the herd and the flock that's among us.
I tend to bow to bros when I salute. That's just something I do. But maybe if you salute a brother, like actually, you look at him, look at his countenance, look at his face, and sometimes you can tell if a brother just needs to talk, or if a brother, you can ask a bro, "Hey, you good?" Whatever, or you don't even have to say a word. His face alone lets you know what you need to go home and pray for. So. We're all tired. We're all tired. We're all irritated, stressed out. Babylon, man, we wish Babylon was gone yesterday, but hey, we're here and we still got to push it through. So this is Proverbs chapter 27, verse 17. And I know the world always reads only the first part of it, but you got to continue throughout the entire verse here. It says, Proverbs 27 and 17, it says, "Iron sharpeneth iron, so a man sharpeneth the countenance of his friend." Right. So let's get the word sharpen. All right. It's Hadad, I think. Yeah, Hadad in the Hebrew. Okay. And that means to be alert or keen. Here's the word keen, acute. If I'm not mistaken. Yeah, the word acute pops up, meaning sharp or at a sharp angle. All right. It says highly developed. All right. So when I say, like, you got to look at it, and when I say brothers kind of like hide what they're going through in their countenance, is because they're highly developed in the spirit. The Lord quickeneth. Even bros who just came in. The Lord dealeth with you more than the rest. Like, straight up, you could have been in the truth for 6 months. The Lord deals with you way more than he does an average Joe Schmo. The scriptures talk about that in the book of Ecclesiasticus, where more things have been shown unto you. So the Lord's dealing with you. So your face, your face develops. Let's see.
That's all I really wanted to play. But the brother makes, a lot of more beautiful points through the spirit, man. I didn't have a timestamp. If I had a timestamp, I would have went to another timestamp. But damn. Yeah, but I want to get this here in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 1. It says, "For as much then as Hamashiach have suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. For he that have suffered for he that has suffered in the flesh have ceased from sin." And it's a common speaking point about how brothers, are arming themselves with the like mind of Yahweh Shai. When you go into the ministry of Yahweh Shai, you see how much attention to detail Yahweh Shai had for his flock, for the apostles, for the men around him. The Lord had great care, and great attention to detail for the men around him. And as we put on the like-minded Yahweh Shai, it's not only in sufferings, but also in dealings with the Lord's sheep, the flock, the brotherhood. The Lord was the ultimate example of being his brother's keeper. The scriptures say how Yahweh Shai prayed for us. Lord willing, we're the elect. The Lord prayed that we be not taken from the world, but we be given the spirit to endure it. Roughly paraphrasing. The Lord prayed for brethren because he knew, he seen the signs when he was here. He witnessed it for himself. He knew. And as we put on this like-minded Yahweh Shai, we have to do the same, to the best of our ability. All right, with the attention to detail, with the great care that the Lord had for his brethren, we have to exude for our brethren. All right, because really our brethren are extensions of Yahweh Shai. I had this on ChatGPT. It says, what is your brother's keeper? It says, to be your brother's keeper means to take responsibility for the well-being of others. And at the end of the day, this is bigger than just us as individuals. All right, this is about the collective. The scriptures speak about the commonwealth of the nation of Israel. All right, this is about the collective, all right, of the nation of Israel. Right now, it's about the collective remnant, all right, that the Lord has left behind. All right, it says it means to take responsibility for the well-being of others, to care for them, look out for them, and not ignore their needs. You got to remember that we are needy. All right, we still need attention. We still need care. All right, the scriptures say here, Isaiah 61 in verse 1, the Spirit of the Lord powers upon me, because the Lord have anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He have sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and opening of the prison to them that are bound. All right, and just because we've entered into the knowledge of the truth doesn't mean that we are, not, we still aren't brokenhearted. It doesn't mean that we still aren't captives or we still aren't bound. All right, we're still a part of the brokenhearted, the bound, the captive. We just received, the yoke of Yahushua, which has made it much lighter. All right, but we're still brokenhearted. All right, brothers are still dealing with, trauma coming from Babylon. Still dealing with their own perspective, trials and tribulations. So when you look at it like that, we still are, brothers still need help. Brothers still need to be anointed. Prophesied, preached unto of the good tidings. Brothers still need prayer, all right, to mend up those broken hearts, those broken minds, spirits. Like the priest mentioned, brothers are tired. And that spirit of tiredness, man, it really is a demon. Jake is getting tired at the end. You got to pray for that, man. Pray for Jake, man. Pray for brothers, especially brothers that you see are getting tired, because you can see it on the brother's countenance. The priest mentioned it in his lesson, and I can attest to it as well with my small tenure in this truth. You can see when a brother is tired, and you can see when a brother is really waning in the spirit. You can see it. It's not something that's hidden. It's not something that just comes out of the blue. A lot of times you can see it. When a lot of times brothers say something, brothers pray for brothers. But when you see it, you're supposed to pray for brothers, man. Especially now, because that tired shit, really, that ain't it, man. That ain't it. The Lord has a lot going on right now. There's a lot going on the behalf of the elect. It's just no time to be tired, because the Lord is getting ready to ramp up the spirit in the planet Earth. We got to pray for brothers to be in a vigorous spirit. a rejuvenated spirit, you know. But it says to care for them, look out for them, and not ignore their needs. Because one thing that we become also through the Spirit are spiritual physicians. You know, alongside prophets and priests, we become spiritual physicians as well. Spiritual detectives, as the elder Kazamagan from the DC camp, you know, says, we become spiritual detectives. All right. We see different spiritual clues. All right. We're able to put together the pieces with the wisdom that we've been given from on high. And as we put together those pieces, we know exactly what to pray for when it comes to brothers sometimes. What the spirit is, you know, groaning. You know, sometimes the brother's spirit is groaning and he don't know what to pray for. You know, like it says in Romans, that 8th chapter, you know, ultimately the Lord knows what to pray for. The Lord knows what we need. And sometimes the Lord will put it on your spirit to see it as well. The groanings that the brother is going through spiritually. The Lord will put it on you to see it for a reason. So that you can, you know, pray. Pray for that brother, man. You know, because we need it. We need that same love shown to us. But I just want to do this small land back. You know, nothing too long. You know, just something I was meditating on, you know, this past few weeks, man. You know, it's important for us to be our brother's keeper, especially in the time that we're in now. You know, seeing that the Lord is getting ready to enter us into the next phase of this ministry, the next phase of this truth. We're getting ready to go from faith to faith. All right, from e-epistles, e-lessons, to the word manifesting and becoming a reality in our life, to the word becoming a lot more personal, the testimony becoming a lot more personal, the prophecy becoming a lot more personal. You know,
Bros, I pray for bros. I pray to the Lord to give brothers a little bit of breathing room. I know this. I know the scriptures say this is not our rest. It isn't our rest, but doesn't mean you can get no rest. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't mean you get no rest. Just a little bit of breathing room, just so we can continue to push on and push forward. You know, just get the tad bit. All right. I said I'm not going to make this lesson too long, but this is Ecclesiasticus chapter 37 and verse 17.
right? You know, I can't say it better myself. You know, with that, you know, Lord, is edifying unto your elect. I want to give all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahushai, Bahasham, Rakakwadash, and double honors to our apostles and elders of Great Millstone who rule well. Shalom. Stay up.